Welcome, everyone. My name is Francisco Valentin. I am a Spiritual Awakening International facilitator, advisory, and Spanish committee member. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our next conference speaker, Rob Schwartz. Rob Schwartz is a hypnotist who offers between life soul regressions. He has published 3 books which have been translated in 27 languages and is an international teacher on the subject of pre-birth planning. Welcome, Rob Schwartz.
Thank you, Francisco. Hi, everybody. Wave if you can hear me. Good. I always just like to make sure. I don't want to take it for granted. I want to start by thanking Yvonne and Anne and everybody at SAI for putting the conference together and for inviting me to participate in it. It's my pleasure and my honor to be here with you tonight. For those of you who are not familiar with me or my work, I specialize in the area of pre-birth planning. And when I say pre-birth planning, I'm not talking about the pre-birth planning a couple does when the woman is pregnant. Yes, that is a kind of pre-birth planning. That's not what I'm going to talk about here tonight. I'm going to talk about the kind where we plan our lives, and in particular, our biggest challenges before we're born, before we come into body. And I'll talk about why we do that. So I want to start by sharing my personal story with you to give you a sense of how I came to do the work I do now. Then I'd like to share with you what I found in the research for my books, 5 main reasons why we ourselves plan our biggest challenges before we're born. And then I will share with you a couple true stories of pre-birth planning. I want to talk about suicide from a pre-birth planning perspective, and also accidents. And then I'll make some concluding comments and then take a few questions. So who am I and how did I come to do this very unusual work? Believe it or not, I was actually in the corporate world for many years. I have an MBA, and for a long time, I was self-employed as a marketing and communications consultant, basically doing different kinds of corporate writing. I did not enjoy this at all. It was deeply unfulfilling. And perhaps more to the point, I had this nagging sense that went on for years that I had come to Earth to do something else, something quite specific that I wasn't doing, but I didn't know what it was, and I didn't know how to figure out what it was. So I was really lost. I was having what you could call an existential crisis. And then back in 2003, Spirit stepped in, Spirit intervened, and 3 very important things happened, all within a few weeks of each other, the combination of which got me to leave the corporate world and start writing and teaching about pre-birth planning. The first thing that happened, I had my first session ever with a medium. Now, I do these all the time now. I've had hundreds of them for my books. But at that time in my life, I wasn't even sure if I believed in mediumship as a valid phenomenon. But I was lost, and I thought, why not? What harm can come from it? So I go into this session with the medium, and the very first thing she said to me was, your spirit guides are here. And I said, what is a spirit guide? I mean, I'd never even heard the term before. So she explained that. And then she said, your guides would like to speak directly with you. And she started to channel them. The first thing they said right out of the box was, you planned your life, including your biggest challenges, before you were born. And I'll tell you, I just shook my head and I said, well, why in the world would I have done something like that? They said, you did this for purposes of spiritual growth. They then launched into this very lengthy and detailed monologue in which they went through my life challenges one by one and told me in detail why I had planned them. And what was really compelling about this is that they knew what all of my challenges had been without me telling them anything about myself, nor had I told the medium anything about myself prior to the session. So as you can imagine, if you're talking to beings who know literally everything about you without you telling them anything, that gives them a fair amount of credibility. So I came out of this session with the medium with my mind blown wide open. And in the days after the session, I thought about this pre-birth planning idea a lot. The effect that it had on me was that it really created quite a deep healing, because it allowed me for the very first time in my life to see deeper meaning and deeper purpose to the most difficult things that had happened. And then I thought, well, if this perspective can create this kind of healing for me, surely it can create a similar kind of healing for other people. And that was when I first started to think about writing a book on the subject. Now, within just a few weeks of that experience, I was introduced to a woman who has the ability to go into trance and channel her higher self, her soul. So I had the extraordinary opportunity to spend about 15 hours over 5 sessions talking with her soul about pre-birth planning. And her soul explained to me in great detail how it's done, why it's done. This 15 hours of channeling really formed the foundation for everything I went on to do from that point on. And the third thing that happened right at the same time, and this was really by far the most important and impactful of the 3 things, I had a spiritually transformative experience, and thank you, Yvonne, for that term. I had an STE in which I was doing nothing more than walking down the sidewalk in the middle of a weekday afternoon. And all of a sudden, every time I looked at another person, I was overcome by this feeling of pure, overwhelming, unconditional love for that person. Now, I call it pure, overwhelming, unconditional love because those are the words that get closest in the English language, but they really don't even begin to touch this quality of love. I could call it divine. I could say that it was transcendent. Those words get a little bit closer. But this love was of a quality and an intensity and a power that was far beyond anything I had ever experienced, at least since coming into body. I remember this experience very clearly because the first person I saw after the experience began was a cab driver. This gentleman, who of course was a complete stranger to me, was just sitting behind the wheel of his cab waiting for a customer to come along. And I looked at this man and just felt this pure, overwhelming, divine, unconditional love for him. Then I turned around and I saw a man's barber shop on the corner. I looked through the window and I saw the barber cutting a customer's hair. Again, 2 total strangers, but as I looked at them, there again was this feeling of just pure, overwhelming, unconditional love. And then I turned around and I saw a young woman, a mother, pushing an infant in a stroller down the sidewalk. And again, as I looked at them, there was that love. Everywhere I looked, every time I saw another person, this love washed over me and flowed through me. And as this was happening, you could say that I was caused to know. I was caused to know in this experience that we as souls are made literally from the energy of unconditional love. I got that message loud and clear. Now, what I didn't know at the time was why this was happening. That became clear a couple of years later. By that time, I looked at a number of people's pre-birth plans for my first book, Your Soul's Plan. And what I found in every case, no exceptions, the pre-birth plan was always based on complete unconditional love for every person involved. This was true even when great challenges were being planned. It was true even when quote unquote negative roles were being scripted for people. It was always, no exceptions, true for everybody involved in the plan. And then I thought, aha, that experience walking down the sidewalk a couple of years ago, that was gifted to me so that when I found this result in my research, I would be absolutely certain that what I was finding was true. So there you have my story in a nutshell. The combination of those 3 things, the session with the medium, the woman's channeling of her higher self, and this experience of divine unconditional love for all people, the combination of those three things got me to say, okay, I will leave the corporate world and attempt to write a book about how we plan our lives before we're born. Now, let me go to one of the stories in the book. I want to talk to you about suicide from a pre-birth planning perspective. There are two reasons I want to do this. One is suicide is much more common than most of us realize. If more of you had your cameras on, I would probably ask you to raise a physical hand, either if you have lost somebody you care about to suicide or know someone who has. And if I did that, I know from experience, almost 100% of the people here would raise their hand in response to at least one of those two questions, if not both of them. So it's really much more common than I think most of us realize. But the more important reason why I want to talk about it, the suicide chapter in my second book, Your Soul's Gift, contains what I feel is perhaps the single most healing piece of information I've come across in all the years I've been researching pre-birth planning. And for those of you who have lost somebody you love to suicide, this information, this perspective could potentially be life-changing for you. So I want to make sure I get this information to you today. Now, let me set the stage. The person who is the subject of this chapter is an American woman whose name is Carolyn. And Carolyn has lost her only child, a son named Cameron, to suicide. It happened actually just a few days after Cameron graduated from high school. So this was at a time in Cameron's life when Carolyn thought he was just about to go off to college and start doing great and exciting things in the world. And instead, she came home, found that he had hung himself from a rafter in their attic, and she was the one who had to climb up there, cut the rope, and bring the body down. So it was certainly a terrible tragedy. Now, Carolyn and I worked with a channel in the Netherlands whose name is Pamela Krabbe. Pamela channels Jesus, and for purposes of this channeling session, she also channeled Cameron. Somewhere toward the beginning of the channeling session, Jesus comes in. And the first question I ask him is, do we plan suicide before we're born? He says, suicide is never planned as a certainty, but it is planned as a possibility or a probability, or rarely a probability so high as to be almost certain. And then he explains this is the case with Cameron. He tells us that Cameron brought back into body unhealed energies from past lives for the purpose of healing them. And he did this to such an extent that it was actually foreseen in his pre-birth planning session that a suicide would be highly likely. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, why in the world would any soul create that kind of pre-birth plan? It's important to understand that there are several key differences in your perspective between when you're here in body on Earth and when you're back on the other side planning a lifetime. One of the key differences is that from the non-physical vantage point, you are very much aware that a lifetime is actually very brief. It seems to you like it's here and it's gone, like a clap of thunder. Also, from the non-physical vantage point, you are very much aware that nobody is permanently harmed by anything that happens here. And from the non-physical vantage point, you are acutely aware of the fact that the wisdom that comes out of a lifetime becomes part of you literally for all eternity. So from that perspective, that a lifetime is actually very brief. Nobody is permanently harmed by anything that happens here. And yet, the wisdom becomes part of you for all eternity. From that perspective, it actually does make sense that some souls, not all, but some would take on very great challenges the way that Cameron did. Then Jesus steps aside and Cameron himself comes in. And I want to read you a brief passage of what Cameron has to say. And I don't want to paraphrase this because I think you need to hear the actual words that Cameron uses. So he says, quote, "When I came here, I was bewildered and confused. I had not counted on an afterlife at the moment I took my life, but there were guides present beckoning me. I was very lucky to see them. I reached out to them and they told me what had happened. You're on the other side now, they told me, and I was struck with grief. They actually showed me my dead body to convince me that I was really dead. I wasn't aware of this as I was in a state of panic when I killed myself. After I crossed over, they took me to a place of learning and recovering. The first period of time was very difficult. I wanted to go back to Earth, to you," he's speaking to his mother here, "to my family and friends. I could not accept that it was so final. I was full of regret and bewilderment, and it was hard to find peace of mind." Now, you might ask the question here, if it was foreseen in Cameron's pre-birth planning session that a suicide would be highly likely, then why is he full of regret and bewilderment? Why is it hard to find peace of mind? Why is he upset at all about the suicide? The answer to that question is that when we first return to the other side, full memory of the pre-birth plan doesn't come back immediately, it comes back gradually. So Cameron is speaking at a point in linear time here in which he hasn't yet remembered that a suicide was seen as highly likely. So Cameron continues. "I often traveled back to you and my friends, wanting desperately to talk to them, to let them know I was around. Some listened, others I couldn't get through to. Some I reached in the dream state. I certainly got in touch with you. We had some deep conversations with each other during the dream state. You were full of sadness and questions. My guides had to stand by me during those talks because I was so full of grief and sadness myself. I just wanted to come back to you and try again. It took a long time before I accepted that I had done it, that I had really left my life behind, and that I had to start over again. In my talks with you, I tried to tell you that I truly appreciated who you are as my mother and that you didn't fail me. No one failed me." This, as I understand it, is actually the single most common comment people who have suicided make when they are contacted through a medium or a channel. They always say, "It was my choice alone, my responsibility alone. Nobody else is to blame. Nobody failed me." Now, when I'm working on a book, I try to be very mindful of the information that comes across my desk, because I know that if there's something I'm supposed to know about so that I can put it in the book and share it with all of you, Spirit will find a way to get this information to me. And this happened while I was writing the suicide chapter. I became aware of a wonderful book called Conversations with Jerry and Other People I Thought Were Dead by an American author named Irene Kendig. It's a brilliant title, I think. And what Irene does in this book, she talks through a medium with her friend Jerry and other people she thought were dead. In one of her conversations with Jerry, the subject of suicide comes up. And she shares with Jerry through the medium the following true story. It's a very simple story about a brother and a sister named Dan and Denise. Dan and Denise made plans to meet for dinner one night. Then shortly before they were supposed to meet for dinner, Denise called her brother Dan and canceled. Then, during the time at which they would have been at dinner, Dan suicided. He took his life. So now his sister Denise blames herself. She believes that if she just hadn't canceled their dinner plans, her brother Dan would still be alive. So Irene shares that story with her friend Jerry, who is back on the other side. And listen to what Jerry says in response, because this is quite extraordinary. Quote, "Even if she had dinner with him, Dan still would have had to be willing to create an opening in order for her to have made a difference. If he'd been willing to create an opening, someone, in this case Denise, would have stepped in. And even if she hadn't, someone else would have. Something as simple as a smile or kind word from someone would have made the difference. Everything is orchestrated. If Dan had needed someone's assistance to guide him in a new direction, someone would have been there. There is always a response to our needs. Had he been open to such a change, the universe would have responded to the opening. Now, I don't know what your reaction is to that, but when I read this, the implications struck me like a lightning bolt. So I took this story into the channeling session with Jesus. I shared it with him, just as I've shared it with you now. And then I said to him, quote, "This story seems to suggest that every suicide that could have been prevented was prevented. Is that true? If it is, this awareness would do wonders to relieve the guilt people feel at not preventing a suicide." And Jesus responds, quote, "All suicides preventable by outside forces were indeed prevented." I'll read it again. All suicides preventable by outside forces were indeed prevented. So what this means is that if you lost somebody you care about to suicide, there was literally nothing you could have done to prevent it. Because again, if the person has the slightest openness or willingness to change their mind, Spirit knows and Spirit stages an intervention. So for those of you who have lost somebody you care about to suicide, I would invite you now, take any guilt or self-blame you may feel and set it down and step away from it. That's what your loved one wants for you. And again, there was literally nothing you could have done. I'll share with you an interesting personal anecdote along these same lines. A number of years ago, I was in the UK on a book tour. I was in Northern England. It was a Wednesday, and I was scheduled to give a talk at a spiritual study center on a Friday evening. Now, on that Wednesday, and I didn't find out anything about this until long after it happened, but on that Wednesday, there was a young Englishman in his 20s who was sitting at a train station a couple blocks from the spiritual study center at which I would be giving a talk 2 days later. This young man was debating silently within his own mind between what he felt were his only two choices in life. One, suicide, or two, staking out an ATM, waiting for somebody to withdraw cash, and then stealing the cash from that person. He was so depressed and so desperate, he really believed those were his only two options in life. So he's sitting there at the train station debating, which of these two choices am I going to make? All of a sudden, a mysterious hooded figure walks up to him and stands in front of him. When I say hooded, I mean literally hooded. This person is wearing a hoodie, and the hood is pulled so far over the person's face that the face isn't visible to him. It's cast in a shadow. The mysterious hooded figure says to the young man, "Don't kill yourself. Don't rob somebody at an ATM. A couple blocks from here, there's a spiritual study center. Go there, see what happens." And then the mysterious hooded figure walks away. Well, of course, the young man is dumbstruck. He gets up, he walks 2 blocks down the street to the spiritual study center. He meets the woman who owns it. She says, "You know what? There's this American author, Rob Schwartz, who's talking here Friday night. Why don't you come to his talk? It might help you." He did. We got to speak briefly. But my role in this young man's life is a very minor one. The really important thing that happened here is that the woman who owns the spiritual study center took him into her home for several months. He got his life turned around, and then he left, presumably in a much better place. Now, I don't know what eventually happened to him, but hopefully he got his life permanently turned around. That mysterious hooded figure, I think, was probably an angel that took on human form. So he had the slightest openness or willingness to change his mind. Spirit knew that, and Spirit staged quite a dramatic intervention. But the intervention can be anything. It could be a bird flies by and distracts the person, they don't go through with it. Somebody walks by and smiles at the person, they feel a little better, they don't go through with it. But Spirit will do something to prevent that suicide from happening if the slightest openness or willingness to change the mind is there. This, I feel, is probably the single most healing piece of information I've come across in all the years I've been researching pre-birth planning. And for those of you who know somebody who lost somebody they love to suicide, please share this information with them. This can be life-changing for those people. It's pages 410 to 411 in Your Soul's Gift. Now, before I go on to the next story, I want to talk about the main reasons why we plan difficult lives, why we plan big challenges for ourselves. There are 5 primary such reasons. The first is balancing and releasing karma. Now, balancing and releasing karma are not the same thing. Balancing karma means you plan to have a new experience that energetically offsets a previous experience. Releasing karma means you heal the underlying tendency that created the karma in the first place. In other words, if all you do is balance karma without also releasing it, you'll just end up recreating the same karma over and over again. A simple example of balancing karma would be 2 people who have a past life together in which one was ill and the other was the caregiver. When those 2 people transition back into spirit and have their life review, as we all do, they'll see the caregiving relationship portrayed in the life review. And they may or may not feel complete with the caregiving relationship. May is the operative word there. And they decide for themselves, we are complete with that kind of experience, or we feel incomplete with it. They're not told by God or some being or counsel external to themselves, you have karma here, you have to balance it. They decide we're complete or we're not. If they feel complete with the caregiving relationship, then as I understand it, there is no karma, and they'll go on to plan something completely different. But if for any reason they feel incomplete with that relationship, the feeling of incompletion is the karma. So let's say they feel that way, how can they then balance the karma? Well, the easiest, simplest, and most direct thing to do is just to trade places. Now the one who is ill plans the life challenge of caregiving. The one who is the caregiver plans the life challenge of illness. That's reason number 1 for planning life challenges, balancing and releasing karma. The second main reason I've seen in my work for planning big challenges is healing. And I'll give you an example from my first book, Your Soul's Plan. There's a chapter in Your Soul's Plan about the pre-birth planning of deafness and blindness. The deafness story is a young woman named Penelope. She was, I believe, 24 at the time I spoke with her for the book. Penelope was born completely deaf in both ears. Now, she and I had the extraordinary opportunity to go into her pre-birth planning session, working with one of the mediums on the team. And we actually heard the conversation that took place when the deafness was planned. And what we discover as we listen to that conversation is that in the lifetime immediately previous to this one, Penelope had the same mother she has in this lifetime. And in that past life, when she was a little girl, she heard her mother shot to death by the mother's boyfriend. Now, she didn't actually witness the murder, but she heard the gunshots that led to her mother's death. As you can imagine, she was quite traumatized by that, so much so that it led her to suicide later in that lifetime. So Penelope returned to spirit from that lifetime with what you could call an energy of unhealed trauma, which now needs to be healed, similar to Cameron. In the pre-birth planning session, her spirit guide says to her, "My dear, would you prefer to be born deaf so that no similar trauma will happen to you again and so that you can complete your healing from the last lifetime? And Penelope responds, yes, that is what I want and what I wish to do. And then what ensues is a fascinating dialogue in which she and her guide work out the details of the deafness. Just as an aside here, Penelope is African American. The pre-birth decision to be female, African American, and completely deaf was in no way random or arbitrary. One of Penelope's pre-birth intentions was to deepen in compassion. Compassion is what I refer to as a divine virtue. Divine virtue is my term for qualities that are very important to our souls. And one of the main reasons we plan challenges is because from a pre-birth planning perspective, we see the challenges as providing both the opportunity and the motivation to cultivate certain virtues. The average person is working on 2 or 3 in a lifetime. Occasionally, somebody's working on 4 or 5. As far as I know, nobody is working on more than 5. That would be too much for anybody to take on. And in the 2-day online workshop we actually do something called the Divine Virtues exercise, in which you find out which virtues you're working on in this lifetime. But Penelope's intention was to cultivate compassion. She felt pre-birth that this relatively unusual combination of being African American, female, and completely deaf would put her in a lot of situations in which she would have the opportunity and the motivation to cultivate compassion. And in fact, that is exactly what has happened. She's cultivated tremendous compassion, and now she takes that compassion and uses it in service to others. She's a teacher in the deaf community. But that's reason number 2 for planning challenges before we're born: healing. The third main reason for planning big challenges I just alluded to, and that is service to others. I've looked at, I don't know how many hundreds, thousands of pre-birth plans now, in workshops, in group regressions, in private regressions, in sessions with mediums and channels. Every single one of them, without exception, has some component of service to others built into it. It's always there in one form or another, to one degree or another. Now, probably all of you have heard of the concept of oneness. This is the idea that there's actually only one being in existence in the universe. And it's you, it's me, it's all of us. Each of us is an individualized expression of the one. The way I understand the orientation towards service is that it's a natural expression of oneness consciousness, which is our natural state of consciousness when we're back on the other side. So let's say, for example, that you and I are back in our non-physical home and we're planning an incarnation together. And you perceive that I am literally you. It's not just an intellectual concept the way it is here. You actually perceive that I am literally you. Well, then, of course, you will want to be of service to me. And conversely, if I perceive that you are literally me, then, of course, I will want to be of service to you. So this orientation towards service, which again is in everybody's pre-birth plan as far as I know, I think is a natural expression of oneness consciousness, which is our natural state of consciousness when we're home on the other side. That's reason number 3 for planning challenges before we're born: service to others. The fourth main reason is a desire to experience contrast. And let me explain what I mean by that. I shared with you earlier my experience of divine unconditional love walking down the street that day. The non-physical realm we come from is very much as is classically portrayed. It's a realm of tremendous and complete unconditional love. So if we as souls are made literally from the energy of unconditional love, which was my experience walking down the street that day, and if we are in this realm of only unconditional love, that means we experience no contrast to ourselves, which in turn means we don't fully understand or appreciate who or what we are. we don't fully understand or appreciate what it means to be a soul made from the energy of unconditional love. So I think what the soul is doing here on the physical plane is that we have come for the experience of what you could call the not love, which we would all agree there's a lot of, because through the contrast, through the experience of the not love, by the time you go home at the end of a lifetime, you understand much more deeply what unconditional love really and truly is, which is another way of saying you now have a much more profound self-knowing and self-understanding. Now, I realize this is a somewhat arcane concept. So to make it more accessible, I like to borrow an analogy from a book other than my own. Probably most of you, maybe all of you, have heard of The Conversation with God books by the American author Neil Donald Walsch. In one of the Conversation with God books, the subject of contrast comes up. And God asks the author Neil to explain it using the analogy of the white room, which goes like this. Imagine that you are a white being in a white room. So you are white. Everything in this room is white. The ceiling is white. The floor is white. All the walls around you are white. Everything in the room is white, including you. Now, if you are such a being in such a room, how do you know that you're white? The answer is you don't. And in fact, you can't until you experience something that is other than white. Then once you've had that experience, then you understand what it means to be a white being in a white room. This, I think, is what we as souls are doing here on the physical plane. We are love. We are in a realm of only love. We therefore experience no contrast to ourselves. We therefore don't fully understand who or what we are. And so we come for the contrast, the not love, because through that experience, by the time we go home, we understand much more profoundly what unconditional love is and who we really and truly are. That's reason number 4 for planning challenges, contrast. And the 5th and final reason, strictly speaking, this is a subset of number 2, healing, but it's so important, I like to break it out as a separate item of its own. And that is healing or correcting false feelings or false beliefs about oneself. Now, let me explain how this works. Almost everybody has had at least one past life, and usually many, in which certain things happened that caused you to pick up a false belief or feeling about yourself. When I say false, I mean false from the perspective of your soul. 2 of the most common false beliefs or feelings about self are 1, that one is powerless, and 2, that one is unworthy or perhaps even worthless. If you feel or believe yourself to be powerless, unworthy, or worthless, to your soul that feels intensely discordant because your soul knows that that is not true. It's not true about any being from your soul's perspective. And your soul then wants you to heal or clear the false belief or false feeling. So how is that done? Well, here in 3rd density, or the 3rd dimension, if you prefer that term, what will happen is you will draw or magnetize to yourself experiences that seem on the surface to confirm to you that you are in fact powerless, unworthy, or worthless. This is actually a fundamental function of life in the 3rd dimension. The world is set up to mirror you back to you so that you find out what lies within your consciousness, even if it's subconscious. And if there's something there in need of healing, you can then bring it to the light of conscious awareness where you can set about healing it. So again, if you feel or believe yourself to be powerless, unworthy, or worthless, you will draw to yourself experiences that seem on the surface to confirm the false belief or false feeling. Now, I understand that what I have just described might sound harsh and perhaps even punitive, but I assure you it is not the universe's intention to be either harsh or punitive. The universe is loving. And what it's trying to do in its infinite love for you is mirror you back to you so that you find out what lies within your consciousness, even if it's subconscious, and then bring it to the light of conscious awareness so that you can heal it. That's reason number 5 for planning life challenges before we're born, healing or correcting false beliefs or false feelings about the self. Let me share with you another story of pre-birth planning. In my first book, Your Soul's Plan, there's a chapter about the pre-birth planning of accidents. And I'm putting accidents in quote marks here because they aren't really accidents. There are 2 stories in that chapter. One of them is about an American woman named Christina. She is now, I believe, in her 70s. She shared with me the following true story that started when she was in her 20s. When Christina was in her 20s, she was employed as an administrative assistant at a college in California. One of her daily duties in that job was to pick up her boss's mail. The mailboxes were located in the basement of the building in which Christina worked. So one day, just as she had done many, many times before, Christina descended those stairs to the basement mailboxes. But on this particular day, unbeknownst to Christina, somebody had planted a pipe bomb in her boss's mailbox. When she inserted her hand to retrieve the mail, the pipe bomb detonated. The force from this explosion was so great, it picked Christina up off the ground and hurled her 10 feet backwards against a concrete wall. There were 6-foot splinters of wood that were shot like arrows out of a bow into the wall around her. 2 fingers were severed, both eardrums were ruptured, and flames from the explosion scorched her body from head to toe. When Christina got to the hospital, doctors actually had to hold magnets over her eyeballs to extract the shrapnel from the pipe. So we are talking here about a level of suffering that is almost unimaginable to the average person. Now, Christina's recovery took 2 years and 10 reconstructive surgeries. At one point during this 2-year period, she was lying in her hospital bed in a tremendous amount of pain when all of a sudden she heard a voice inside her head, a voice that was not her own. It turns out that the force from that explosion, in addition to doing a lot of damage to her body, had opened up her psychic gifts. She had become clairaudient. And the voice she heard inside her head that day was one of her spirit guides. Her guide said to her, "You planned this." And Christina said, "Why?" Not an unreasonable question, right? And then the guide told her, and here's what he said. He said, "You wanted, before you were born, to have an incarnation as a gifted healer. And you knew pre-birth that if you could heal yourself from the devastating effects of this bomb explosion, you could then take all of that wisdom and knowledge about healing and turn it outward in service to others." And there you see that pre-birth intention of service to others that I spoke about earlier. This is exactly what Christina went on to do. After she recovered from the 10 reconstructive surgeries, she set up a private clinical practice, picked up a PhD in speech-language pathology, and at this point in her career has healed literally thousands of people. She actually has the ability to go into a patient's brain energetically, by which I mean non-invasively, and restore language processing capability in people who have lost that due to stroke or accident. So we're talking here about an extraordinarily gifted healer. And the only reason she can do any of this is because she healed herself first from the effects of that bomb explosion. Now, when I spoke with Christina for the book, she said 2 extraordinary things to me. The first was, she said, "Rob, I have completely forgiven the person who planted that bomb." Now remember, this is somebody who had magnets held above her eyeballs in the hospital emergency room. And yet here she is saying in complete sincerity that she has completely forgiven the person who inflicted that kind of suffering on her. That in and of itself is extraordinary. Now, she didn't do it overnight. She worked with her awareness or understanding of her pre-birth plan over a period of years to get to that place of forgiveness. But she was able to use her knowledge of her pre-birth plan to forgive that person completely. You can easily imagine that she could have chosen instead to be angry for the rest of her life. She could have chosen instead to be bitter and resentful for the rest of her life. She might even have chosen instead to devote the rest of her life to tracking down the bomber and taking revenge. But because she came into this understanding of her pre-birth plan and really worked with it over a period of years, she got herself to a place of total forgiveness. But then she said something even more amazing to me. She said, Rob, I am deeply grateful to the person who planted that bomb. And when she says she's deeply grateful, she really and truly means it. This, to me, is one of the most amazing stories I've seen that shows what you can do with an awareness of your pre-birth plan. Again, she could have chosen instead to be angry, bitter, resentful, looking for revenge for the rest of her life, but she really worked with her understanding of her pre-birth plan, focused on the positives that were intended to come out of it and that did in fact come out of it. And she understands that the person who planted that bomb actually performed an act of service for her. That's how she looks at that. Despite all the suffering she went through, it empowered her to become a remarkably gifted healer and make an enormous difference in thousands and thousands of people's lives. That's what you can do with an understanding of your pre-birth plan. I want to talk just briefly about ascension, which is part of all of your pre-birth plans. You're probably familiar with the term. If you're not, ascension is literally just that. The planet and every person and being on the planet is ascending or going up in vibration or frequency. As I understand it, we've already moved from third density to fourth and are on our way to fifth. Fifth density is a dimension, a frequency of unconditional love and oneness consciousness. So as I understand it, we are essentially going home, but doing it while staying in a physical body. Now, what is causing ascension? Ascension is being caused by divine light, direct from source, flooding the planet. The light creates a process called purification. Purification is a phenomenon in which the divine light brings to the surface, brings to conscious awareness, everything of a lower vibration, everything unlike itself. It has to do this in order for the planet and the human race to ascend, because we can't take lower vibrational things like rage, anger, lack of forgiveness, grievances, false beliefs, prejudices, and so forth. We can't take those things where we're going as an ascended race, as an ascended planet. So the purification process is really intense right now. It's happening globally, collectively to the whole human race, and individually in every single person's life, whether or not they are consciously aware of it. Globally, collectively, this is why you see more craziness in the news than ever before. Individually, what it will look like in your life is that, to put it in the vernacular, your stuff is going to come up. Whatever is within you, within your consciousness, that's resonating at a lower vibration, it's going to come into your conscious awareness now so that you can look at it and let it go. The process of letting it go consists of, number one, experiencing it consciously. Number two, thanking it sincerely for whatever it has taught you, if you can do that. And number three, blessing it. And number four, releasing it to spirit, asking spirit to take it from you. That is essentially how you purify yourself. The most important thing to know is don't resist the purification process. When your stuff comes into your conscious awareness, don't suppress it or don't repress it. Don't push it back down because it's painful to experience. That's the worst thing you can possibly do right now. It will hinder your individual ascension, and it will hinder your contribution to the global ascension. It's my understanding that to be in body for a planetary ascension is a great blessing and a great honor. There were so many souls who wanted to be here for the ascension. There were actually 3 times as many souls who wanted to incarnate now as available bodies. So you actually had to make a 1 in 3 cut to be here. And the way you made that, the way you were chosen, is that you have something specific to offer the ascension process. You may know what that is, or you may not. But be assured you were chosen, you made a 1 in 3 cut, and you have something specific to offer the ascension. The reason I share all of this with you, 1, so that you can understand purification and recognize it when it happens in your life. But 2, I think there is a very universal, natural human tendency to feel small, weak, helpless, powerless, insignificant. I assure you, nothing could be further from the truth. You made a 1 in 3 cut to be here, and you were chosen because you have something important to offer the ascension process. Let me make some concluding remarks, and then I'll take questions. Some of you might know my first book, which is now called Your Soul's Plan, was originally self-published under the title Courageous Souls, and then a publisher picked it up and they retitled it. But that original title, Courageous Souls, I chose that not because it's a reference to the soul. It's actually a reference to you and me, the incarnate personality, because I think it takes a tremendous amount of courage to plan a lifetime on Earth. And it takes even more courage to execute the pre-birth plan once you get here. Now, sometimes when I say that, people will say something to me like, well, Rob, how am I supposed to think of myself as courageous when I'm afraid so much of the time? There's so much fear in my life. The answer to that very good question is that each and every one of you knew before you came here that fear was going to be a big part of the package. There was no way you could not have known that. I would submit to you that only the courageous plan fear. I'll say it again. Only the courageous plan fear. So when you have that moment of low self-esteem, or that moment of wondering what the heck you're doing here, or maybe even that moment of wishing you could get the heck out of here and go back home, this is the moment to, and I mean literally do this, go to a mirror, look into your own eyes, and remind yourself of who you really and truly are. Say to yourself, I am a holy, eternal, courageous soul. I'm the brave soul who left a realm of love and light and peace and joy to come here to Earth to experience great challenges so that I could balance and release karma, heal, be of service to others, experience contrast, and correct false feelings or beliefs about myself. Because in my view, that's who each and every one of you really and truly is. So that is my story, and I am going to stick to it. Thank you for being here tonight, and I will be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Your presentation was very compelling. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now let's take some questions. Here we go. First question from Rochelle. I might be misunderstanding, but if everything is script, that implies that we do not have free will, which is what I have previously heard. Can you elaborate on this?
I'm sorry if I gave you that impression, because that is not at all what I'm saying. We do have free will. So when we talk about pre-birth plans, it's important to understand you don't just have one pre-birth plan, you have many. My wife is a channel. She channels a group consciousness, a collective of very highly evolved beings who we call affectionately the beings of light. I'll explain it to you the way they have explained it to us. They say, imagine that you have a stack of sheets of paper in front of you, a big stack. Each single sheet in that stack of papers is one set of your pre-birth plans. So every person has their own stack of sheets of pre-birth plans. Each sheet varies according to vibration or frequency. The sheets that are toward the top of the stack are the highest vibrational pre-birth plans. Those are the plans where most of the learning is done through love, peace, and joy, not so much through pain and suffering. The sheets at the bottom of the stack are the lower vibrational plans. That's where most of the learning is done through pain and suffering, not so much through love, peace, and joy. Your free will determines which sheet you're on at any given instant in time. And essentially, the way you get yourself up the stack of sheets, so to speak, it's quite simple, although not necessarily easy. And that is, anytime you have to make any kind of decision, whether big or small, ask yourself the question, what would love, with a capital L, do now? And whatever the answer to that question is, do that. The more you can do that, the more you move up that stack of sheets of paper. And that's where your free will comes in.
Thank you, Robert. Second question from another Robert. I would love to hear if you are planning another book and what is it about?
There are actually two that are in the works, both of which I'm working on with my wife and the beings of light. One of them will probably not be ready for several years, and that book is about the pre-birth planning of large-scale events. There's another book that is coming along a lot faster that I think will be out later this year. It's a collection of channelings of the beings of light through my wife, and I write a commentary or a reflection about each one of the channelings. So that book, we're thinking of calling it Wisdom from Within. I don't know if we'll stick with that title or not, but that will probably be out sometime later this year. If you go to my website, which is yoursoulsplan.com, something will pop up right away that allows you to sign up for the email newsletter. If you sign up for that, you'll be notified when the new book comes out and about everything else that we're doing.
Perfect. Thank you. Another question. This is from Mike. This is a two-part question. Okay. Question is, why is it that the newly dead do not remember their life plans after they arrive beyond the veil? Also, I have read that young children who pass are taken to special school for caring. I would think they will remember their plans and not need special care. I'm confused.
As I understand it, everybody does eventually remember their plan, but it isn't instantaneous when you cross over. The memory comes back gradually. As to why that's the case, there's probably a physics explanation in there somewhere that has to do with the difference in density, going from the extreme density of Earth to the much higher frequency of the non-physical realm. It somehow, through the principles of physics, and I'm not a physicist by any means, but it takes a while to filter through the molecules and for the memory to come back. That's the extremely unscientific explanation I can give you.
Okay. Next question from Liliana. The question is, in case you have had sessions with this kind of cases, what are the reasons to be born with autism and almost total lack of unique communication skills?
In Your Soul's Plan, there's a chapter that's titled, I believe it's called Having Disabled Children or Having Handicapped Children. The woman who is the subject of that chapter has two children who are on the spectrum, one severely autistic, the other much less so. In that particular case, and I think this is an explanation that is unique to them, the story here is that both of the sons were incarnate in Nazi Germany, and they worked for the Nazis in the propaganda department, which is another way of saying they knew what the truth was and they intentionally distorted it. They felt in their pre-birth planning session that they wanted to take on the challenge of autism to one degree or another, because they would be challenged to communicate the truth. That's the lesson they wanted to learn. They wanted to have the truth and be challenged to communicate it in honest ways in which they hadn't in that past life. Now, the thing that I want to emphasize in sharing this story with you, neither one of those souls was being punished for having been a Nazi. That simply does not happen. Karma is not a punishment. It's your feeling of incompletion with a particular experience. You choose whether or not you want to balance it. If you feel incomplete, as I said earlier, that's the karma. They felt incomplete after the lifetime as Nazis, but this was their choice, and they weren't punishing themselves. It was not a self-punishment either. They were learning lessons that they chose to learn.
Okay. I believe this is a question. It says, Rob, regarding suicide, I have heard the concept that if a person commits suicide, they may be cutting short a learning experience and may have to come back again specifically to complete that lesson.
That does happen quite a bit, as I understand it. So here's my understanding of what frequently, not always, but frequently happens after somebody suicides. There are almost always a large number of pre-birth agreements with a large number of people that have yet to be fulfilled. Now that the person is no longer here in a body and no longer has a body to do whatever they need to do to fulfill those pre-birth agreements, what they end up doing from the other side, they're acutely aware of all the agreements that have yet to be met. And so they, you could say, almost run around frantically on the other side, trying to influence a large number of people who are still here in body to do the things that they would have done if they had stayed here. Now, out of that large number of people they try to influence, some hear them, but some don't. Out of the group that hears them, some do as they ask, and some don't. So ultimately, this becomes a tremendously frustrating experience because they just can't get enough people to do what it is they want them to do to fulfill all of the agreements. And so somebody who's in that position is very likely to feel incomplete with the previous lifetime and choose to come back and finish that which was left incomplete.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Next question. What are your thoughts about assisted suicide when death is needed to stop the excruciating physical suffering caused by a disease, not because the person wants to live the physical life?
My own personal view is that there is nothing wrong with that. And I will tell you, I didn't read this section to you, but in the suicide chapter in Your Soul's Gift, Jesus states, and I believe the exact words are, suicide is not wrong, suicide is not a sin. God or spirit does not look at it that way. God has the greatest compassion for those who take their lives in despair. That's almost word for word the way Jesus put it. And he actually states in another part of the channeling that his intention is to take away the traditional judgment that suicide is a sin. Now, that is not to be taken in any way as encouragement for suicide. That is not what that means. All he's saying is that the way God and Spirit looks at it, it's not viewed as a sin. There is no judgment of it.
Okay. Thank you for that answer. Next question. This is from Nelson. My question is, what do you think of Dolores Cannon's work, which mirrors what you have stated regarding ascensions and changes to even our planets? And what do you think of the extraterrestrials?
What was the last part?
What do you think of the extraterrestrials?
Certainly, I'm a little bit familiar with Dolores Cannon. I know who she is and essentially what she did, but I don't know her work in enough detail to really comment on it. But I hear from people whose opinion I respect that she was quite the pioneer, quite the groundbreaker. So I would encourage anybody who's interested to take a look at her books. And apparently there are quite a few videos from her on YouTube as well. Extraterrestrials, this is not my area of expertise, but I do myself subscribe to some newsletters from people who channel certain extraterrestrial consciousness, like Pleiadians, Arcturians, Lyrans, Cassiopeans, and I'm forgetting certain other ones, Andromedans. There are definitely very highly evolved, very loving extraterrestrials who I believe are overseeing our evolution, overseeing our ascension process. Very highly evolved, very loving, and I'm glad they're on our side.
Okay, next questions. Are spiritually emergencies planned?
That is a good question. As a general rule, the more important something is, the more likely it is planned, at least as a potential. So a spiritual emergency obviously is something that is extremely important, is likely to have a profound impact on the direction you go in life. So I would say almost certainly it's planned, at least as a potential, probably as a probability, and probably quite often a high probability.
Okay. Next question. Please give an example of why one will reject the time we are asked to purify and ascend. Very confused.
People do this kind of thing all the time, and not just in an ascension lifetime. Nobody wants to feel painful emotions. It's just human nature to want to push them down and not experience them. The average person responds to the arising of painful feelings by self-distracting. And in our society, there are a billion ways you can distract yourself. Sex, drugs, alcohol, the internet, work, shopping, on and on and on and on. So if you find yourself responding to your pain by self-distracting, don't judge yourself for that. This is human and natural and understandable. But notice it and then decide, is this really the way I want to go? Does this habit of self-distraction really serve my spiritual evolution? And you know, if you need to self-distract now and then just to get away from something that's painful to feel or think about, that is not the worst thing in the world. It just really becomes problematic if you do it all the time or almost all the time, because then you end up blocking your healing, you end up blocking your service to humanity, you end up hindering your own ascension, and surely those are things that you do not want to do.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What if the pain is so immense for decades with no relief that it beats you down to a point of diminishing returns? What if they are in over your head and feel you can't learn anything because there's so much suffering that you can integrate the experience for growth?
This is going to be a lot easier for me to say than for people to do. But the answer is surrender. Give up. Just give up. Don't resist anything. Your suffering is not caused by what happens to you. It's caused by your resistance to what happens to you. If you had literally no resistance, you would experience literally no suffering. Krishnamurti said, quote, "I don't mind anything." What he meant was nothing bothers him. And the reason nothing bothered him is that he never went into resistance to anything. So there are different ways that you can cultivate a surrender practice. A very good teacher who I like for surrender is Michael Singer, who wrote The Untethered Soul, The Surrender Experiment, Living Untethered. He posts several lectures a week at, I believe it's TOU.org, which stands for Temple of the Universe. I would dive into those lectures. He is very good at explaining what surrender is and how to do it. But essentially, you need to come up with some kind of practice that works for you, that allows you to stop resisting the pain and the suffering. I'll give you a personal example, just by way of providing an example. So I recently had, without going into too much detail, a profound spiritual experience, some of which was quite intense energetically. And as this was happening, I knew intuitively that I needed to surrender to the process, not resist it in any way, just allow it to happen. A lot of energy was moving through my physical body. And so I thought to myself, it would really help me if I had some kind of metaphor or mantra I could repeat in my mind that would encourage me to surrender. So I started to say to myself, I am a tea house. I am an infinite tea house. I have an infinite number of rooms. Every thought is welcome here. Every feeling is welcome here. Every sensation is welcome here. Every being is welcome here. Come, have a cup of tea with me. I said that over and over and over, and it really allowed me to relax, surrender, and not resist anything that was happening. And I'll share with you the kicker to the story. My wife was with me while this spiritual experience was taking place. And this tea house mantra or metaphor, I never actually said it out loud. She never heard me say a single word of that. I was just thinking it in my mind. Well, as this experience was taking place, my wife fell asleep. And when she woke up, she said to me, I just had the strangest dream. This big burly man with a very peaceful energy came to me and he said, I've come for the tea. I said, boy, do I have something to share with you. So we took that as confirmation from spirit that this mantra or metaphor, whatever you want to call it, this surrender was the way to go.
Okay. We got only 1 minute left. How about ghost or lost souls? Is that planted too?
That is not something that I have researched, so I'm hesitate to speculate on it. Certainly, there are what we could call earthbound souls, people who have left the physical body and have not moved into the light for any number of reasons. Sometimes they have an addiction to tobacco or drugs or alcohol, and so they'll glom onto the energy field of somebody who has the similar addiction as a way to continue to feed it. So they choose not to move into the light for that reason. There are a number of other reasons too. This is not my area of expertise, and I don't want to speculate as to whether it's part of a pre-birth plan because I've never looked at it.
Okay. Well, thank you, Robert. We ran out of time. Thank you for everybody. Thank you for your nice talk. I loved it. I personally loved it.